All right, welcome everyone. Again, I am Cashin Yu, Program and Event Coordinator for the Community Action Partnership and the host of today's event. The Community Action Partnership has a grant from the Office of Community Services to develop and manage the Risk Mitigation T&TA Center. One of our activities is producing webinars, toolkits, and training materials on topics of critical interest to the CSBG network. All previous recordings and copies of presentations are on the T&TA website through the resource bank. Again, that's at www.csbgtta.org. We encourage you to explore the resource bank, consultant bank, discussion forum. There's a calendar, or you can register to submit a request for training and technical assistance. So with that, I'd like to start to transition here to today's speaker, Kate Soul. That's a name you have likely heard before. She has written several different guides and toolkits through the Community Action Partnership. She does a fair amount of training for us, for CAP Law. She's worked with NASCAS, so this is a name that you probably have seen crop up before. She is honestly in all aspects of grant organizations. So this is your chance to have the expert on the line, so we do encourage you to put your questions in as they come through. So with that, we're actually going to just let Kay take it away for today. Kay?
And I am delighted to be back with this group. I've met many of you at the partnership conferences and CAP Law conferences and state association conferences. And actually, I am looking forward to this subject that we're going to talk about, organization-wide budgets. And as we get started, I actually have a first poll question for you. And I think Cashin is going to put that up. We're doing our projection a little bit differently, and I may not see it when she puts it up. So Cashin, is it up now, our first poll question? Yes, it is. I can see it. Okay, well, I honestly want to know the answer to this question. And, you know, nobody is watching you. No one will know what you say. And what I want to know is, quite apart from someone telling you you should do this, you should have an organization-wide budget, I really want to know how useful you think it is. And first, I want to hear that from the perspective of your board. Do you think your board really gets any benefit out of seeing and discussing an organization-wide benefit? And you'll see our choices there, and I really do want you to be candid. And the second question is, what about you as managers in community action? How useful is it to you to actually have an organization-wide budget prepared each year? And if you will give us your honest answer, it will be tremendously helpful. I feel like I have seen some change in our network of community action agencies over the last 5 years, and so this question is a chance to kind of tap in on that. So, are we getting any answers there, Cashin?
We are. We have several that have come in, and the poll just closed. There were a few people that were in process of getting those answers in, so we'll try to capture those, and we should be able to display back out to you in just a moment.
Okay. Well, this is the fun part because we do get sort of instant reading of what people are doing. Okay, well, I think we had some candid answers, and I'm looking forward to actually asking you this question at the very end of the webinar, too, and see whether anybody's opinion has been changed by what we talk about today. Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started, and I think to do that, I have to advance our slide in our new way of doing things here, and there it goes. So this is how I've organized the material for the webinar. It's kind of obvious. We're going to talk about, well, what is an organization-wide budget? Why would you do it? Who would you need to involve? When would you do it? And also, how long would it take? And how would you do it? And finally, that last bullet, I think, is the crux of the matter in terms of what makes this a challenging process. So I'll start with my own perception about what is an organization-wide budget. I would say It is a comprehensive plan for the operation of your organization that takes into account all the different sources of funds that you will have and all the uses you will make of them, including, quite likely, your in-kind contributions. And it gets a little more complicated when you're a community action agency that's involved with affordable housing. We're not going to go into that in this webinar, but I'm happy to discuss that with people who face that challenge. Now, we're going to focus today on a one-year organizational budget done on your fiscal year. But I want to acknowledge that many organizations are trying to extend their planning horizon out over 2 or 3 years. It's just that I generally find we don't have the detailed information needed to produce this comprehensive budget on a 3-year cycle. And so I'm a great fan of doing a detailed organization-wide budget for 1 year and then doing more of a financial projection or forecast for the subsequent years. Now, one of our big challenges in community action is that we have so many different grant and contract agreements, and of course those grant and contract agreements are on all different time periods. If only we ruled the world, we could make all of our funders line up their grants and contracts with our fiscal year, but we can't. And so we know that when it comes time for us to prepare an organization-wide budget for our fiscal year, there is going to be a lot of work to be done to be sure that we have consistently incorporated all the different funding agreements that are on different time periods, as well as the ones that match up to our fiscal year. And we're going to talk about, well, how do you do that? And finally, I would say it really is not possible to produce an organization-wide budget that is useful to anyone if you are not using a cost center format. Now, people have called the same thing by different names, so I thought I'd show you what I mean. Obviously, there's a total column, and we're going to break it out into the purpose of our various expenditures: management, fundraising, lobbying. In this little example, they had homeless services and energy assistance. Now, I know that most of you have between 20 and 80 different contracts. And you can see that what this whole presentation is going to emphasize is the need to get to a summary level. But of course, you are doing the budgeting on a very detailed grant by grant level, and then you're pulling it together into the big picture. Now, that last slide just looked at expenses, but in fact, in an organization-wide budget, we are going to be looking at income as well as expenses. And this format that's up on the screen right now is a high-level summary of all that detail that is in the budget. But I think it's a pretty important format because it helps everyone understand that in our organizations, we do have income that comes to us associated generally with our different programs or services. We can't spend it on other things in most cases. And we do have direct expenses to provide those services. And there is a difference between the two, and hopefully when a funder says, I want you to do this service, they are at least willing to come up with enough money to pay for that service. But we know that where the trouble comes is in getting funders to cover the allocated or common costs. Now, with the super circular, we may be seeing a whole new world. We're not there yet, and my guess is even with the super circular, we're still going to see situations in which the total income that is provided to us to do a particular program is not sufficient to cover the direct expenses and the shared expenses. And that might be shared by way of your indirect cost rate or by way of a cost allocation plan. Now, we're going to come back to that subject as we go through the webinar. So that's a little bit of a conversation about what it is, and now we're ready to talk about, why do it? But before we plunge into that, because we're going to be talking about that from several different perspectives, Cashin, could you put up our poll about who's with us on the webinar, what roles we have represented in our group of participants?
Sure can, and that poll is opening. So if you could take a look at that right side panel where it showed up last time, and let us know a little bit more about who you are.
Yeah, this will be very helpful to me to know sort of where to slant my emphasis as we go through the various elements of preparing this budget and using the budget. So if you are willing to reveal who you are, then we will look at the results of that poll, and you'll also have a sense of who else is with us on this call, and hopefully of why I am making the choices that I am about where we will put our emphasis. So have we given people enough time, do you think?
Yes, so the poll is just closing, and again, we had a few late responses, so we'll try to see if we can capture those and send them right back out to you in a few seconds.
Okay. Great. And then we will, once we see who's here, we're going to move on to the question of why do this, and then we'll keep going and get to how to do it. Okay, we have a mixture with us, and that's kind of what we expected. We're heavy on the CFO, so we're going to focus in particularly on some of the strategies they'll be using, but I hope as we go forward that we can also reflect some of the challenges that those who are program directors and board members and others really confront. So let's return to why do it. And here's the starting point for me. I think it's the best way to actually test whether your various plans for your different grants and programs are actually going to work together to give you a good financial outcome by the end of your next fiscal year. It's also about the only way I can see to actually demonstrate the impact of your cost allocation plan and to demonstrate your compliance with the requirements for how cost allocation is to be done fairly and how indirect costs are to be applied if you do have an indirect cost rate, how that is to be a fair allocation. And because it really steps into the area of compliance, having this organization-wide budget is actually an excellent way to avoid audit findings. What kind of audit findings? Well, your cost allocation plan, it wasn't reasonable and it wasn't fairly applied. So we're going to keep going, and we're going to say, if I can move my slide forward, yes, more reasons to do it. And we're actually going to see an example of the first bullet here. And it's unfortunately an example I've seen in real life where because the attention was so focused on the individual grant and contract budgets, both the executive director and the board lost track of the fact that there were going to be uncovered costs that no outside funder had agreed to pay, and that the consequence of that was going to be an overall loss. Now, the other thing that I think is helpful is that the organization-wide budget helps us make visible what the financial impact of our different funding agreements really is. And I hope that you're going to see that in the end, if you can get a good format for presenting this, it is really going to help both management and the board understand the choices. Now, we are looking at a sample budget that the folks at WIFLE have prepared as part of a project they're doing with the partnership. They're doing a toolkit on budgeting, and this is the sample organization-wide budget that will appear in that toolkit. We're going to come back and talk about this sample as we go through the webinar, but I want to point out something that is, to me, the best illustration of why do this. If you go down to the bottom of this slide and look where that red arrow appears, you're going to see a negative $104,000. And what this is telling the board and the executive director is that if they go forward with this plan that has emerged from all their different grant funding, they are actually going to use $104,000 more in discretionary, unrestricted funds than they're going to bring in. And you know what the consequence of that is going to be is their organization operating at a loss. Now, you might have a question about, well, why isn't the loss over in the far column as big as that reduction in the unrestricted funds? Well, that's because, fortunately, in that column-headed service grant, that is one of those rarest of all contracts where you're actually allowed to make a profit. If only we all could have some of those. Now, we're not going to go into the detail of this sample right now, but I do want you to see how much just getting it summarized to this level calls out a big decision for both the executive team and the board to make. Is this going to leave our organization financially healthy, or is this a plan to really erode our net worth? So more reasons. I hope you're already persuaded, but more reasons are that, you know, if you've read the Super Circular, you know how much emphasis is in there about strong internal controls. And the comparison of budget to actual is an essential internal control. Now, you could say, well, we do that because we're always comparing the expenses in a given period in a given grant to that grant budget. That is part of the internal control, but it is not the highest level control where your executive and your board are really thinking about what is going to be the financial outcome to our agency of what is happening this year and using the control of comparison of actual to budget. So it's really essential to see the combined impact of everything we're doing. Now, if you haven't been persuaded yet that this is really a good idea, then I guess we could go back to the CSBG Organizational Standards and say, well, whether you think it's a good idea or not, it is a required step that the governing board approve an organization-wide budget. Now, you could take a mechanical compliance idea and just give them a single column total for the whole agency, but that would really be pointless, and it would not get at what we're really trying to do, which is engage the board in understanding the impact of the different components of our operation. So I would say that getting the budget into a good cost center format is just essential as a tool for effective boards. Management, and I have to share with you, I do have a really strong bias on this subject, and some of you know that I'm sort of odd in that I've been an executive director, I've been a fiscal director, actually, and a contract accountant, and I've also been and still am a very active board member. And so I want to share my bias, which is I look at agencies as complex as most of our community action agencies are. And I say, you know what? The staff, the management has to take primary responsibility for grants management. You are the ones, if you are on staff, if you are the executive director or the finance director or the program director, you are in the position to monitor your grants compliance and to make sure that you are following each grant budget appropriately. But your board has a responsibility to protect the financial health of the organization. And to do that, they've got to both approve a plan for the overall operation, and then they've got to be able to manage, to oversee that plan by having useful financial information, including the comparison of budget to actual. Well, let's go from why, and I have to tell you that we're serious about inviting you to submit questions or comments as we go along. You go ahead and put them in the Q&A section, and I will sort of incorporate them as we go through the webinar. I do want to start with a little bit of discussion of who should be doing this annual budget. You know, nice idea, but who's actually going to do the work to get this done? And I would say a lot of different people are going to have to work together. starting with the CEO and the CFO and whatever kind of executive leadership team you have in place. And in most organizations, I find that leadership team may include not only the CEO and the CFO, but if there is an HR director, if there is an overall program director, if there is a development director, who's on your top team, they've got to be involved. And it becomes clear really quickly that we have to also engage the program managers, the program directors, and even down to the supervisor level. We have to ask the people who actually know what's going on a direct level to be part of this process. I think there's a very strong and important role for the Board Finance Committee, and there is a role for the full board, but it isn't figuring out the details of the budget. That is a management job. Okay, so let's talk about what I hope you as CEO are doing in relation to the budget. I hope that you are really holding not just your CFO, but your whole management structure accountable for participating in the budget. If you're just turning this over to the CFO and say, well, it's time for you to do this, good luck, I don't think that's going to work. I think you have to really support them by insisting that all managers are going to participate actively and that once a timeline is established for doing the budget, they're going to meet the timeline. Because one of the reasons that budgeting goes wrong is we get pushed and we do it at the last moment. I think there's another important role for the CEO, and that is sitting down with the CFO way at the beginning of the budget process and identifying what are the critical choices we're going to have this year. Now, that represents a philosophy that says there are choices. Some people see this preparing the annual budget as more of a technical exercise. We're just going to pull out the budget components from all our different awards and grants, and actually we've made all the choices when we negotiated those budgets with the funders, so there's nothing to decide. I find that's not true. For one thing, most of us are in situations where we're being called upon to raise unrestricted funds and local share for more and more of our programs. So we have some decisions about that, if nothing else. And I also think many of us have recognized that it's kind of tough to say we're fighting poverty when we're busy creating it by paying extremely low wages. And so a number of CEOs and CFOs will say, one thing we're putting on our list of critical choices is what can we do about raising the wages of our lowest paid staff? What can we do about making sure we have good benefits? So I think the other key CEO role here is to work with the Finance Committee to be sure we understand what they are concerned about and what they want to see demonstrated in the proposed budget. Now, ultimately, the CEO is going to take leadership with the board chair and the Finance Committee chair to make sure the board is ready for the big budget discussion where we're going to ask for budget approval. And the other thing that I think is pretty important for the CEO is that, again, they don't just delegate this whole thing to the CFO, that they actually use their understanding of board members and board members' understanding to be sure that we are putting our annual budget into a format that our board members can follow and understand easily. But obviously the person that's going to carry the heaviest load in the budgeting is the CFO or the fiscal director. And, I know that if you're a very large organization, you probably have fiscal staff you can delegate pieces to. But I would say I hold that top fiscal person responsible for making sure that the budget process works well and is timely. And I also hold them accountable for designing a budget format that actually works for people. Now, that's kind of high-level stuff. On a very practical level, we're going to have to count on the fiscal department to provide the core personnel and overhead cost info. After all, how would program directors know the details of our benefits and how that actually impacts personnel costs and the details of our overhead costs. So this is where fiscal people have to get the information out, and I hope you're continuously getting that information out, because you know a lot of program directors and program managers are negotiating with funders all along. It doesn't all happen just when we're doing the annual budget. And that last bullet, providing technical assistance, really essential. In most organizations, we have a combination of long-time program directors and a lot of pretty new people. We're going to have to do some technical assistance to help our newer managers really understand how the budget process works, what information they're going to be asked for, and how to think about financial information. Now, somewhere in that fiscal office, whether it's the top person or someone else, someone is going to have to stay on top of some of the key cost trends. And usually I start my list with health insurance because that is, in my experience, the most volatile area. But you probably have some other volatile areas where somebody needs to really dig in and figure out what's likely to happen. Now, I hope that you have a system that has your fiscal office continuously reviewing new funding agreements before they ever get signed. But now, as we get ready to do the annual budget, is a time to be sure that we've done that and to be sure that we really understand what's in all those agreements in terms of both what are they offering to pay for and also what are they requiring of us. Now, if your organization is going to be talking about some major changes, then part of the CFO's job is going to be to actually sketch those changes out on a spreadsheet, actually do a financial model. What kind of changes am I talking about? Well, I'm meeting more community action agencies that are deciding they want to do more in private fundraising. Well, you know, it's not going to fall from the sky just because it got included in the strategic plan. We're probably going to have to spend some money to raise some money, and so we're going to look to the fiscal office to project what's the return going to be on various levels of investment in fundraising, if that's a direction you're going, or if you're going more towards the earned income direction. Really, it's the same question. What's going to be the financial outcome of investing more in our earned income strategies? And I think that in most cases, we're going to have to count on the CFO, the fiscal director, to facilitate the discussion in the executive team of the options that emerge through the budget. CFO has a close relationship with the Finance Committee, so that's where we're going to see some identification of key issues to be addressed, and hopefully going to get some good conversation about the document that goes to the Finance Committee, and then takes a lead on following up on what the Finance Committee asks for more information about or wants investigated. Now, if you are the program director or the HR director or the development director, I hope you're part of the executive team and that you're going to play a role in helping the CEO and CFO identify the key choices and actually chiming in and doing your portion of the budget projection for the areas of your responsibility. We're going to have to be sure that whatever comes into this annual budget is consistent with what's in our various funding agreements, and those who have direct responsibility for those agreements are the best people to check that out. I think our program director roles, it really does come down again to those funding agreements. Are we sure that we have correctly incorporated them into the annual budget, and that whatever we've put into the budget for each grant is actually going to cover the cost of meeting the requirements for those grants? Because even though that agreement may already be enforced, it's already got a budget, if you identify a problem area as you work on your annual budget, there's still time to negotiate an amendment with that funder, and now's the time to get it done. I think in most of our organizations, we do look to the program directors to propose the best staffing model for their program. And this is a tough one because of the way we have to negotiate with funders on all different timelines. But that doesn't mean it's impossible, and it's certainly important. Now, increasingly, I am seeing community action agencies look to their program directors to actually play a role in income generation. And whether it is looking for those earned income opportunities that will give us program income, whether it is realizing that a funder now has structured an agreement on a unit of service payment basis, and if we don't meet the target number of units of service, we're not going to get the money. I think we have to look to those program directors to understand what has to be done to bring in the money that we need to operate the program. So with all that staff work, what's the board finance committee going to do? Well, I hope they are looking at your strategic plan and actually thinking about what we said our priorities were and helping to figure out whether this agency-wide budget that I'm being asked to review is connecting appropriately to the strategic plan. And if it isn't, then to raise the question, well, why did we say in the strategic plan that we were going to put more emphasis on, for example, serving the Latino communities in our area, but I don't see any budgetary changes at all that would suggest that we're doing anything new or reprioritizing. Our strategic plan says we're going to raise more money from private sources, but I don't see any additional investment in doing that. So we have to ask that committee to help us keep that focus on our strategic goals and make sure that it is getting incorporated into the actual budget. And finally, you know, at the end of this budget process, we're going to ask the Finance Committee to recommend the budget to the full board. And I hope that one of your key Finance Committee roles throughout the process is really getting Finance Committee members to understand how finances work at your organization. Where does the money come from? What are the problem areas? What are the choices we've made? So it's an education role. Now, practically speaking, well, when management gets done pulling together the first draft of the comprehensive budget that they feel good about, they think this is the plan that they would like to recommend, that is a time for the Finance Committee to take a look and to raise questions and let staff know if we need to get additional information or if they would hope for changes. And then when we get those revised numbers coming back to the Finance Committee, if they are satisfied with the budget prepared by management, we want them to recommend it to the full board. And that really does bring us to what is the role of the full board. And, you know, I hope that your full board understands that staff have carried the primary responsibility for preparing this budget. It is a recommendation from management. And the board's role is not to go back and check the math. The board's role is really to look at whether this plan is consistent with the strategic plan and with the mission of the organization, and especially to consider sustainability. Now, remember, we looked at that sample budget that's going to be in the new toolkit, and we saw that that plan called for using up more unrestricted resources than would be brought in during the year. And we also saw that the plan called for an overall deficit where expenses would exceed income. So I hope the board discussion of that budget would talk about sustainability. Can we keep going on like that? Now, after you've had hopefully a good discussion on a high level rather than an exercise in getting out our calculators and checking staff's math, I hope that then the board will decide to approve the organization-wide budget just like is required in CSBG and just like all of us as staff want, because that's going to give us the authorization to go forward with the plan. Well, I think this may be a good time to actually ask how many of you are preparing an organization-wide budget. And Cashin, do you have that poll?
We will momentarily, asking whether they actually prepare an organization-wide budget.
Yeah, that's the one.
All right, well, that is the one that is open now on that right side panel. And you do have 40 more seconds to get those answers in.
Right. And I hope now that we've talked about, what am I talking about when I use the term organization-wide, it'll be clearer whether your answer is yes, we currently do this, no, we don't, or I don't know whether you would really say what we're doing is an organization-wide budget. So we'll see what the poll answers to that are, and then we're going to get down to the hard question, well, how long does all this take anyway? And how do people find time to make this happen? So how are we doing here? I see we're cast your votes, yes, no, not sure. And do we know the results, Cashin?
We will momentarily. It is calculating those, so we will know in probably another 10 seconds or so. I can display those back up. We need,
quiz show music while we wait for these tabulations. No,
we haven't got quite that sophisticated yet, but you're right. We could make it a game show.
Okay. Well, there you can see the answer. We are far from everyone doing this. And that is consistent with my experience in talking with community action agencies. I think 5 years ago, we would not see the yeses as the largest group. So I think that's pretty interesting. Well, we're going to go on and we're going to talk about the timeline. And, obviously the goal is to get the board to approve the budget before the beginning of the fiscal year. So if you are an organization that is running July through June, hopefully at least by that June board meeting, we've got board approval of the budget. Does that always happen? Honestly, it doesn't. People get behind and they decide that they're going to extend the prior year budget for 1 month, or that the board is going to be willing to approve the budget retroactively. But in terms of a potential audit finding, we really do want to get the budget approved before the year begins. Now, in my experience, this is generally requiring 3 to 4 months for the whole process to play out. And I hope that, the only way you'll ever get it done in 3 to 4 months is if someone, probably the CFO, lays out an actual work plan and timeline for who's got to do what by when, and agrees to monitor progress and to notice when things start falling behind and to figure out what's hanging this process up and to actually take action to make it work. So now, let's see if I can, there we go. So, as I talk to people about what makes it hard to do these organization-wide budgets, the number one thing I hear is, well, good grief, do you understand that we have 70 different grants and contracts and they're on at least 7 different time periods? So it's just, mechanically, it's just so difficult to take that into account. Number 2 worry and challenge I hear about is uncertainty. We just don't know. I was just talking with a community action director this morning who said, here we are, it is now September. Our county government, which gives them a substantial amount of money, is on a July through June year. We've been told to continue providing services, but we are missing contracts. We have no contracts for many of the services we are providing. So talk about uncertainty. They really are living in a very uncertain world. Now, for those of us that have gotten more into private fundraising, working with individuals and businesses and even with foundations, the timing is not only on the foundations is uncertain, but the results on the individual and business fundraising are often fairly uncertain, particularly if you're new to private fundraising. So these are some pretty significant challenges, and hopefully we can talk through a process to cope with those challenges. So the beginning of that process really is to establish a cost center structure that you're going to use. And, you know, the big choice that you're going to make is, do I want to do that by, well, we know the major way that any nonprofit does cost centers is we got to have management, we got to have fundraising, and we got program. But we got to go way deep into the program arena and figure out whether our structure is going to be based on grants, and we're really going to set up a cost center for every grant, or whether we're going to take the other permissible approach, which is to think about programs as our cost center, and we might have 3 or 6 or 20 grants feeding into a program. For example, some of us would say, well, the program is homeless services, and I do have 15 different contracts that pay for homeless services. Now, either way can work. It's just a matter of figuring out what your structure is going to be. And I would say the very next step is actually doing a position-by-position personnel schedule where we're going to identify all the positions we will have during the year, during the fiscal year, and attribute them, assign them to cost centers. So, you know, this is what I'm talking about in terms of a cost center format. And if these people, like in my example, the homeless services actually has 15 grants, we would have lying behind this summary presentation on a different spreadsheet worksheet each of those 15 grants, and we would be rolling them up into the homeless services. Now, this cost center format, again, just is looking at expenses. We know by the time we're done with this, we're going to look at income too. But I want to look first at this personnel schedule. And really what's going on here is we are just looking at every position that will exist. We're figuring out how many months it's going to exist for, because many of our positions are not full year positions. And then we are attributing it to a specific programmatic cost center. So whether it's a grant or a sub-program or a program, we're going to put it in its place, and we're going to be looking at the 12 months of our fiscal year. Now, you know, this sounds easy. Well, why don't you just dump this out of your personnel system and you've got all this information? But what I find is you've got to have a sort of iterative process where you're going back to the different grant agreements and making sure that the staffing levels that you're attributing to a particular grant do match up with what is in that budget. And that brings us to one of the biggest challenges dealing with these multiple grant years. And we've got to figure out how to extract the information that belongs in this fiscal year's budget. So I found some version of this worksheet is what I end up doing, that I go through, I go grant by grant, award by award, contract by contract, and I do one of these worksheets for each one. And I start with, well, what's in this award? And I got to know, was this a 18-month award, a 2-month award, a 12-month award? And what I really want to know is how much of this award was already used up in the prior fiscal year or will have been used up. Because, you know, again, giving my example of I'm trying to budget for a July through June fiscal year. I'm working on this in April. I really do need to predict by the end of June how much of this award will we have used up, because that's going to tell me how much is going to be left to put into this new fiscal year budget that I'm working on. And, you know, it's possible that we're also going to have some left over because maybe this is a 3-year award and we have to have some funds available for services that are going to go on beyond the fiscal year that we're budgeting for. Now, this is a lot of work. And it probably ends up getting done in the fiscal office because that's where we have the records of what our expenses have been during the current year. And then it's going to be collaboration between fiscal staff and the program director to figure out, well, how much are we going to use up by the end of June, and what are we going to spend and need to spend down in the fiscal year that we are preparing the budget for. So, we are just building a linked set of worksheets in Excel. And some of us have, of course, some specialized accounting software that does have a budget feature, and that can be very helpful. Whatever works for you, but the important thing is if you want this budget to be meaningful, we do need to be able to go back in and dig down to the award level and be sure that we are not projecting having funds from this award available for the year that we're doing the budget for that actually will be already spent by the time we enter that year. And that is a common beginner's mistake, that they will say, well, that contract from the city, that's a $100,000 contract. I'm going to drop $100,000 into our budget. But if it turns out that you've already spent $25,000 of that, we know that what you need is $75,000, not $100,000. Okay, well, another big problem, administrative costs or common or shared costs. Now, why is this a problem? Well, a lot of us have really gotten kind of trapped by funders that just refuse to pay their share of administrative costs or common costs, and we've agreed to budgets with them that don't incorporate a fair share of those shared costs. And then we say, well, I can't attribute this much rent or this much telephone or even this much administration to that cost center because we don't have any money to pay for it. It's not going to work to do it that way because remember that our compliance requirement is fair allocation of costs. Now, I'm hoping, and I bet you're hoping, that with the super circular, we're going to have some improvement in how our funders are covering our indirect costs, and that's going to solve part of this problem. But I don't think it's going to change the need to be sure that when we look at each cost center and start building the organization-wide budget, we can see evidence of fair cost allocation among every cost center, including those that have funders that won't pay their fair share, because we need to recognize that the outcome of a funder that refuses to pay the fair share of a shared cost is a loss on that contract. And we're either going to have to fundraise for somebody who wants to help put that program on, or else we're going to have to use our unrestricted funds. We got to test it out and see which programs are creating these losses and which programs might be helping us, like that contract that we saw in the sample budget. Okay, as you're doing this, I hope you're following the general principle of saying that I'm going to spend most of my time on the line items that take up most of the money. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time being excruciatingly accurate on a line item that takes up less than 1% of our total budget. I'm going to realize that for most of us, personnel cost is the largest cost, and I better get that right. The other thing I'm going to pay most attention to are the areas where there is volatility. Okay, now I see a great question chatted in. Do you care to comment on the pros and cons of accepting grants without administrative costs allowed? Well, I do have a view on that, and it's not going to be very satisfying. I'm going to say it depends. It really depends on what your situation is in terms of access to unrestricted funds. I know some community action agencies that are doing very well in raising private dollars, and one of the reasons they want to do that is they say sometimes the funding to do program innovation does come with these crazy no admin or not enough admin, and I want to be able to take those awards to have the program funding. And other people will say, no, it's not that. It's that some of the worst funders in terms of refusing to pay their fair share are the ones that are paying for the program services that matter most to people in our community, and I just couldn't live with myself if I turned that down. And you know, I've been having conversations in some states about energy assistance that really focuses on this issue, depending on how the state is handling it. And, you know, really, if you look around and say there's nobody else here who could provide energy assistance, then we're in something of a bind. And we're going to come back to that question towards the end of the webinar. Now, this is the place where you can really see what's happening, because if you go to this net income format in your summary budget, you are going to be able to see which of your cost centers are adding to your net income and which of them are creating losses. And as I said before, most of those losses are going to come because of the failure of a funding source to pay for allocated expenses. Now, I do want to return to the sample that we had from the toolkit. And I actually want to talk about this a little bit more to make sure that everybody is seeing what has happened here and what they have dealt with in this budget. And I'd say start just by looking at the column headings, Head Start, CSBG, weatherization, all the old familiar friends. Know that the service grant that they're talking about is one of those rare contracts where you can make a profit. You can see what they've done in terms of projecting the grant revenue. They've got one that has program, they got two that have program income, Head Start and the state housing grant. That's how they got to the revenue numbers. And then, you know, they used something like that grant award worksheet that we were looking at to identify from each of these sources which expenses are going to be covered, which direct expenses are being covered. And then down at the bottom of that expense section, you're going to see a line that says indirect admin expenses. And this is really demonstrating that they are allocating out their admin expense pool. First, they're collecting up admin and other shared costs, and then they're distributing them according to a fair cost allocation plan. Now, you can see what happens once they do that. And by that, I mean, look at the line that says profit or loss before transfers. Well, there is the direct outcome of what happens when a funder will not pay the full cost of doing the services. And look in the weatherization column. We've got a shortfall of $108,000, and in the housing grant, a shortfall of $153,000. Okay, so there's the problem. Now, in that next section, the transfers, this is one method that can be used to show how you're going to address that problem. And of course, a lot of us would say, well, start with CSBG because there is some flexibility, and it's permissible in CSBG to go ahead and use those dollars to augment other funding sources so long as the people being served through those other programs are CSBG eligible. And, you know, it's supposed to be an actual augmentation. We're not supposed to be using CSBG to substitute for the inadequacy of another funding source, but to augment the services that are offered. That's the subject of a whole other discussion. But you can see what they're planning to do. They're planning to take what had looked like a profit in the CSBG column, $158,000, and they're planning to transfer it in to pay some of the costs of the weatherization program and the housing grant program, and also to pay some of the administrative costs associated with those two programs. And by the time they make those transfers, they're going to bring CSBG to 0. They're going to bring weatherization to 0. This is the bottom line down at the bottom. And they're going to bring housing to 0, which is, what we need to see. But what you realize is there wasn't enough money there in CSBG to do the job. And so they've had to dip into discretionary or unrestricted support. So this is the format, and I think one of the benefits of this format is that if I'm on the board or finance committee, I can really get it. And I've probably been hearing about, well, we use CSBG to fill in around the edges. I've probably been hearing about that for a long time. But I'm not sure that it's really clear to people what we're talking about. Now, of course, what I'm worried about in this plan is that negative $104,000 in the discretionary funds, because, I'm looking as a board member that doesn't look to be good for our financial health. But the format is excellent. Now, some of you have seen this sample. This is a slightly different way of displaying the same information. This is one of my samples, and I am going to keep moving because it's just more of the same, just slightly different display. Now, I think we do want to mention the importance of being sure that we are following what's in the strategic plan. And, don't people say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result? Well, if that's true, a lot of our strategic plans must be made by crazy people because we do expect a different result from doing the same thing. So if you've been talking in your strategic plan about increasing sustainability and building unrestricted net assets, budget needs to show how you're going to do it. Okay, well, I'm going to pick up the pace here because I know we need to keep moving forward. Now, this whole business with agency-wide budgeting is an iterative process. You're going to put it together as best you can, and then you're going to look at the results, and maybe you're going to say those results are not acceptable to us, and we're going to have to go back and make some changes. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about dealing with uncertainty, and, how do you make a projection of something when you don't have the information? And I guess the guiding principle has always been, well, be conservative on the income and expect the worst on the expenses. So, you're going to go through these steps and you're going to adjust it until you get to a plan that you think has an acceptable outcome. And, you may fool around and test some different uses of CSBG, but where you're going is to get to an acceptable overall outcome. Now, I think this big problem of dealing with uncertainty, one of the small steps that I've found very helpful is to make a distinction in your income section between grant funds that have already been awarded, you have a signed contract, and those that you believe are going to be awarded, but they are uncommitted. And some of us even go so far as to say, I'm going to use 3 line items in the income section. One for the committed grants that we already have a signed agreement, another one for the uncommitted, but we have verbal assurances that this is right and how it's going to be, and the third one for what we're hoping is true, but we don't have any assurances at all. And I think if you can see that really clearly, what's certain, what's uncertain, and what's really uncertain, I think that leads to a more realistic understanding. So, okay, we've got the initial draft together. We're sure it's complying with all the funding agreements we have. We've thought about sustainability. We've thought about the strategic plan. And where we're coming is that ultimately it's going to be management's recommendation to the Finance Committee. And the Finance Committee is going to be the first screen for whether they are satisfied with that recommendation or not. They're going to take a look at financial health and the strategic plan and what about those unrestricted funds. They're going to basically tell management either this is fine, we can recommend this, or no, we believe changes are needed. But eventually we're going to get to the point where the Finance Committee is willing to recommend management's budget to the full board. And this is where I know board members get frustrated, and executive directors are beyond frustrated if they find that the board just dives down to the detail. Well, I see in our energy assistance program that we're spending an extra $100 on office supplies this year. You know, that's kind of ridiculous when we're talking about a $20 million budget. So this is all about board training. It's about the leadership of the Finance Committee chair in presenting the budget, and it's about the format. If you don't want that kind of discussion, then you're going to use a more highly summarized format that calls attention to the important issues that the board should be paying attention to. So I've got that one in there again, but I'm going to keep going back and say, you know, I think that sometimes we get so caught up in preparing the budget document and getting board approval that we kind of forget how we're going to use this budget as a management tool. And so I just want to be sure that we don't end this webinar without talking about how important it is that we get that organization-wide annual budget formatted in a way that it's going to be really useful to both management and to the board as an ongoing tool and control. So, you know, we want the CEO to keep a focus on the overall financial health. And we want the CFO to keep that focus too, but obviously we're looking to them to also pay attention to our compliance with restrictions. And we want program managers not only to deliver good services, but to actually pay attention to cost control, keeping costs within the budgetary limits. Some of them we have to ask to pay attention to income generation. And I would say all of them we have to ask to pay attention to compliance. So we've got people that we have a lot of expectations about what they're going to do, and we've got to give them some reports that will actually help them do it. And this is highly summarized, and we're going to take it down to a little more detail. But, you know, I mentioned I have been an executive director for many years, and I got to tell you, this is really what I paid attention to first. When I got a report on our year-to-date income and expense and net income, I would compare it to the annual budget, or, you know, if you have time to do it accurately, you could use a year-to-date budget. But if you are just dividing the annual budget by 12, don't waste your time. That's no better than using the annual budget. So for right now, just say it's the annual budget, or in your system you might have a year-to-date budget that you want to do that comparison. Why am I looking at it? Well, are things going the way we thought they would? But it's that fourth column over, the projected year end, that is the most important column to me as an executive director, as a CEO. You know, our life is filled with changes. After you approve the budget, a lot of things are going to change. And what I really want to know is, given what we know now, given how the year has proceeded, what's the end of the story? How are things going to turn out at the end of the fiscal year? Are we going to have a net loss or a net income? So while you might want to break out some key income items and some key expense items, I'm not sure that you want any more than one page worth to just call the attention to not only how are we doing compared to the budget, but what's the end of the story going to be. Now, if I'm a grants manager, and that's usually somebody who's at the program level, I have a different question that I want addressed. I want to know what the grant-to-date expenses have been and income has been compared to the grant budget, and I want to be able, and why? Well, that is really what I'm going to be held accountable for. You know, nobody's going to be happy if we come to the end of this grant period and I have not fully expended the funds. And they're certainly not going to be happy if we come to the end of the grant period and I have overexpended. So at that program manager, grants manager level, we've got to be able to dip back into our accounting system and give them a grant-to-date actual to compare to the grant budget, because that's what they're going to be held accountable for. But I also want my grant managers to understand how it looks on a fiscal year-to-date basis, because that's what the executive director and the board are going to be focused on. Are we generating losses for this fiscal year? And you know, you look at that projected column, and the person who's going to have the best information on how's the year going to turn out in relation to this grant is the person most directly managing what that grant is paying for. So I really want to get my, whether we call them program manager, program director, whoever is managing the money for a specific program, I want to get them engaged in this year-end projection, because I really want to know whether we're going to come out in the black or in the red. Now, when we talk about the board's use of the budget, you know, I hope that the questions that the board is going to focus on are, again, not, oh, it looks like we're over in our office supply expenses, you know, maybe we should shop online. That is not a good board discussion. We want them to understand the reports compared to budget in relation to the strategies that they identified. We want them to be aware of problems. We want them to evaluate management's recommendations. And we really want them to stay focused on this sustainability question. So this format is very similar to the CEO format. It includes the fiscal year-to-date information compared either to the annual budget or, if you like, year-to-date budget, and it has that year-end projection. And I think it's when we put that year-end projection in that we really help board members step out of the micromanagement, sort of trying to redo management's job, and into thinking about the impact on financial health of the organization. So a lot of us are going to dashboards, and you know that the partnership and CAPLA both have good information on dashboards. And the question comes up, well, how much program level information do board members really need to look at, and how much do they need to look at expenses by line item? Now, I have to say that, you know, some of our funding sources do require that the board review expenses on a line item basis. I think it's misguided, but that's the requirement, and so you gotta go with what your requirements are. A lot of us are instead finding it more helpful to use some sort of graphic, like the stoplight metaphor, where we go through and we give board members information about our different programs, and we characterize that information. And you'll notice this is net income information, and we characterize it as good news, bad news, or think about it news. And you got to be really careful with using net income, because some of the ways that some of us record income would result in it always looking like it's positive, and then until it goes negative. So that's not going to work, and that's another discussion to have. Now, some of us are preferring to give board members information that is just a comparison of actual year-to-date to the year-to-date budget or to the budget as a whole, and then showing a variance, favorable or unfavorable. But the key thing here is you'll notice that this is highly summarized by program. Now, that is in contrast to the classic income statement report, where we start going down through every line item. Now, the problem is, if you're presenting a report like this to the board, and you have combined all of your programs together, everything all pushed together in one report, it's pretty meaningless, right? Because it could appear that the net income is just fine when one of your programs is actually incurring tremendous losses that are going to be problematic. And the programs that seem to be experiencing profits that could offset that may be programs where no profit is permitted. So I don't think it's very helpful information for the board to look at it all aggregated. But even worse is the format where we say we've got 40 agreements. I'm going to give board members 40 pages of financial information, and I'm going to invite them to dig into the micro level rather than think on the strategic or organizational level where we want them to be. Okay, well, we can't really finish this up without saying, yeah, we do have to have budget revisions, and what you really have to agree on is a threshold with your board. When does it take board action? And when could the board be satisfied with simply seeing the projected outcome, the year-end projection? But before we get into this discussion of next steps, Cashin, there's one more thing I want to ask you to do. I want to have you give that honest opinion poll again and just see whether we have anybody who changed their mind at all about the usefulness of an organization-wide annual budget. So can you put that one back up the second time around?
I can, and that is open.
Okay, so now I just really want to encourage you to tell the truth here. You know, what do you really think? And, you know, you're not going to hurt my feelings if you used to think it was useful and listening to all this you think it's useless. You know, whatever. I just really want to know what your thoughts are about how valuable is the organization-wide budget as a tool for management and as a tool for the board. And while you're doing that, we'll talk about these next steps. And, you know, I always feel when people have spent an hour and 15 minutes on a webinar, I hope you're going to end up with something you want to do differently. I know it might not be related to anything I said, but I just hope before you leave the room, you will jot down a few things that you want to investigate and think about. And I also want to let you know that I'm happy to answer follow-up questions by email. You just send them into Cashin and she'll forward them on to me because I feel like this is really difficult and it is also important. So if we can help, that would be great. And let's see, it looks like our poll is just about ready to close. And we'll see what our results are. And then hopefully, I hope some of you were able to watch this webinar and listen to it with someone else from your organization, and you may be able to sort of do a little joint reflection about any areas where you would like to think about change. Well, I'll go back and compare our results to the first time around on this poll, and I just really want to thank you for doing this, and I look forward to hearing how your annual agency-wide budget process is going, and if you think you have developed a particularly just really useful format, I would love to see it. So again, I would just encourage you to share that with Cashin, and if you want us to share it with the network, we will. Okay, and with that, I think we're finished.
That sounds good. And like Kay said, if there are additional questions that do crop up, please feel free to send them our way. I did put my email address in the chat window at the beginning. I did want to note, I did get a couple of questions about the toolkit that Kay was mentioning, and that is called Fiscal Fundamentals for Executive Directors. It is coming out very, very soon, before the end of the month. We did do an introductory webinar where we tried to step through all of the sections yesterday, and I believe it's part 2 of that four-part guide is on budget. So we do encourage you to keep an eye out for that, and that is where you will see one of the samples when she mentioned the Whipsley developed sample as one of the budgets that will be in that toolkit. It is also in the handouts that were passed around at the beginning. So let's see, we have 1 or 2 quick things coming in, which all seem to be thank yous and accolades. So again, send those questions if you have them. we will go ahead and close up today. There will be an evaluation that will come up at the end as soon as we get closed out. We do appreciate your participation in that. Gives an opportunity to tell us what you thought about today, as well as what you would like to see from the partnership in the future. So encourage you to take part in that evaluation. So with that, any last words before we sign off, Kate?
No, I just wish you luck on doing this, and thank you for being part of this and for answering the polls. Really appreciate it.
All right, then. Hope everyone has a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you.